Morning. Morning. Bon matin. Hi. Bon matin, tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. I want to start by acknowledging that we stand on the unceded, unsurrendered land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Delighted to be here with my colleague, Mike Morrice, the MP for Kitchener Centre. This is an important day in our democracy as politicians, parliamentarians return to Ottawa to face the questions that Canadians will have for them. And this has been, quite frankly, a hellish summer for many Canadians. One thing that this summer and the laws of physics in general show us is that it is much easier to destroy things than to rebuild them. And that's true for the 34 million acres of forested land that has burnt throughout the summer after having grown over decades, if not centuries. But that's also true with our social fabric here in this country. After decades of fights by activists trying to defend the rights of workers and women and minorities throughout this country, we have here at home politicians who now exploit the divisions and seek to destroy the things that make us Canadian. The caring, nurturing society that we have is now under attack from someone who has been sitting in Parliament for 20 years, someone who pretends to be a spokesperson, a defender of average Canadians, but someone who has very little in common with average Canadians, someone who has been sitting in Parliament slashing in our public spending during the Harper years, someone who is very much responsible for the state of affairs that we're in right now, someone who is responsible for the divisions that we now see in our society. That someone, of course, is the leader of the official opposition. And as we return to Parliament, we will make sure to highlight all the contradictions that M. Poilievre is bringing forth in his statements. C'est important que les progressistes aujourd'hui s'unissent et travaillent un peu plus ensemble. On fait face à de grandes menaces pour l'intégrité de notre pays, pour l'intégrité de nos valeurs canadiennes, des menaces qui viennent d'ici, de l'intérieur de la Chambre des communes, des menaces qui malheureusement, vont coûter cher aux Canadiens. Ça coûte cher de voter conservateur. Ça coûte cher parce qu'on se ramasse avec des gouvernements qui coupent dans les finances publiques, qui détruisent les institutions. Puis après ça, bien, ça demande plusieurs années de reconstruction par d'autres gouvernements subséquents pour rebâtir puis ramener le pays là où il était lorsque les conservateurs prennent le pouvoir. Donc, on a vu ça avec les années Harper, after 10 years, the Harper decade, which Mr. Poilievre was instrumental in designing and creating and upholding. We saw Canadians suffer from these tax cuts, and now it's taken several years for us to come back somewhere near what is a bit more of a progressive nation, but there is still a lot more that needs to be done. And this is what we're going to be focusing on with our colleagues in the House of Commons. Les Verts ont toujours travaillé à travers la division politique à la Chambre des communes. On va continuer à faire ça pour faire passer des pièces de législation qui sont importantes pour les Canadiens. Non seulement on va se battre sur les questions de logement puis d'abordabilité, mais aussi évidemment sur la crise climatique. On a eu un été infernal, un été qui a coûté des milliards de dollars aux citoyens canadiens à travers la destruction de nos forêts, à travers des évacuations qui sont extrêmement coûteuses. C'est pour ça que c'est important d'avoir une force nationale qui se bat, qui est capable de se battre contre les feux de forêt. We're calling for a national federal firefighting force, as well as a climate emergency task force that is federal, that will be able to coordinate the efforts between the provinces, the municipalities, and the federal government. Because as we see with the fires, fires do not respect boundaries, they do not respect jurisdictions, they cross over, they affect the lives of Canadians throughout the country, as we saw with the smoke that was surrounding people in Toronto and Montreal, but coming from fires hundreds of kilometers farther. So we need to have more coordination. This summer showed that the federal government has not been doing nearly enough in terms of preparing preparing our country for the coming storms, and we will be actively asking the government to ensure that we have plans in place to face more of the same. We know that more disasters are coming our way, and it is important to save lives and protect Canadians as big oil continues to pump the carbon that is killing us in the atmosphere, thanks in parts to the support that it receives from this current government. I want to talk very briefly about C226, which is Elizabeth's legislation on environmental racism. She will be, we are hoping that this piece of legislation will pass during this session. And now I'm going to turn the mic to Mike to discuss his own priorities. Thank you. Merci.
D'abord, merci Jonathan et merci à tout le monde pour être ici avec nous ce matin. C'est un vrai plaisir de vous voir. It's a real honor to be back with you all this morning and a joy to be back in Ottawa. I'll share just three top-line priorities, of course, starting with the housing crisis that we are in. This is a time where in my community, as one example, in Kitchener, we've seen the number of people living unsheltered triple in just the last 3 years alone. We've seen the cost of housing rise exponentially, and this has an impact. There is no one that is not impacted by the gravity of this crisis. As Greens, we're going to continue to propose constructive solutions, recognizing this is 3 decades in the making, where federal and provincial governments have reduced funding as compared to the early 1990s to build the housing we need. We're going to continue to call for transformational investments to at least double our social housing stock, that is subsidized rental units. Even if we were to do so, we'd still just be around par within the G7, while also recognizing that homes are meant to be for people to live in and not simply commodities for investors to trade. As it stands right now, for every 1 new unit of affordable housing we're getting built, we're losing 15 to the financialization of housing, where corporate landlords, recognizing the weak rent controls that exist across the country, and certainly in my home province of Ontario, are raising rents, rent-evicting folks, and taking away what used to be previously affordable units. And so we're going to continue to call for addressing the financialization of housing. As just a litmus test, Greens, we brought forward a motion about a year ago now, that if the federal government were serious about addressing the commodification of housing, they would end any exemptions for corporate landlords. One example is real estate investment trusts who are tax exempt. The parliamentary budget officer has now studied that. It'd be about $300 million over the next 5 years that could be used to build the affordable housing we need. If they were serious, we would have already implemented that. We're going to continue to call for ending that exemption, for bringing those funds to build the housing we need, alongside other critical measures like an acquisition fund to really address the root cause of the housing crisis. When it comes to climate, as you heard from Jonathan already, this year alone, our country is on fire. Over 131,000 square kilometers burned from wildfires across every province and territory across the country, more than double the previous record from 1995. And the emissions, of course, over almost 1.5 times our annual emissions from the trees that have burned, which only then further, these climate-fueled wildfires only then further fuel the crisis. We need to recognize the emergency we're in. We need to stop with this talk of looking at which subsidies we ought to keep. We need to be looking our kids, our grandkids, our nieces and nephews in the eye and say, is this what we ought to be doing in the midst of the crisis? Do we want to look back and say we were too busy looking at which subsidies to the oil and gas industry we wanted to keep? Instead, we should be canceling the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the $30 billion that have gone into that new fossil fuel infrastructure, what the UN Secretary General has called economic and moral madness. We should be ending all subsidies to oil and gas and using those funds to invest in proven climate solutions, from transit to renovating homes. And we should be looking at addressing the sector most responsible. And so I've put forward a motion calling for a windfall profit tax on the oil and gas industry. This is something that the federal government has already done when it comes to life insurance and banks, recognizing that the oil and gas industry is making record-breaking profits while gouging Canadians at the pumps. While some might tell you that the carbon tax, the carbon tax went up 2 cents a liter in the last year, the profits of the oil and gas industry went up 18 cents a liter. At a time when we're living in a climate crisis, we ought to, at the very least, be introducing a windfall profit tax on the oil and gas industry, using those funds to invest, again, in the proven climate solutions we need. Finally, we need to be addressing poverty across the country, and to do so, we should be starting by lifting up people with disabilities who've been living in legislated poverty for far too long. 40% of those living in poverty are people with disabilities. As Greens, we're going to continue to call for the Canada Disability Benefit, which would be a benefit from the federal government to ideally lift people with disabilities out of poverty. We're going to continue to call for that benefit to be introduced more quickly than the 18 months that has already been announced. We're going to continue to ensure that people with disabilities have a seat at the table. An amendment that I was successful in introducing at committee almost 6 months ago now calls for collaboration with people with disabilities. We're going to look for this government to honor what is in Bill C-22. And as well, recognizing that poverty didn't take a break over the summer while Parliament did, and we need to be doing more for people with disabilities in the short term. And so this afternoon, I'll be introducing a petition that over 6,000 people across the country have signed, calling for a disability emergency response benefit to do more to recognize the crisis that those with disabilities are living through right now and get them the support that they need. Across the board, as Greens, we're ready to continue to work right across party lines to put people ahead of parties, to focus on the priorities of Canadians, and to work constructively to get things done for them. Alors, merci encore à tous pour être ici avec nous ce matin. Et maintenant, je suis disponible, et Jonathan aussi. Both Jonathan and I are available to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thanks. You started off the news conference by attacking Pierre Poilievre, so can I ask, what do you make of his rise in the polls right now, especially given his slogan about axing the tax and leaning on technology to fight emissions?
Poilievre's rise in the polls is a sign of our failure on the left to meet the needs of Canadians. And when I say our failure on the left, I will lay most of the blame with our Liberal colleagues who have come to power promising to reduce inequalities, to fix Canada after a disastrous decade of Harper policies, and have not delivered as quickly as they should have. Now, Poilievre is, through lies and deception, is rage farming across the country, creating divisions, sowing division, not, of course, mentioning his own role in creating the crisis that we're in. Again, this is a man who's been in Parliament for 20 years, who voted to cut taxes, who voted to cut critical public services during the Harper years, and now comes back and says that he is the savior of the middle class. He isn't. We're still reeling from the damage of the Harper years, which he was instrumental in creating. And so the left, progressives, have to be have to become much better at delivering the goods that are being promised. Once again, I lay the blame at the foot of our liberal colleagues, but we are committed as Greens to work with all progressive forces in this country to make this country work. Now we need to look forward. We will be faced with immense challenges from the climate emergency, from an unstable international situation. Inflation, of course, has domestic roots, but it also has international roots. Not everything can be fixed through domestic policies at this stage. And that will require more leadership from Canada and our politicians on the left here at home, and we will be delivering that.
And just staying on topic of the carbon tax for a bit, we've got even some Liberal MPs now saying that there should be an exemption or a carve-out for Atlantic Canada. So is the discourse shifting around the carbon tax right now?
Well, I don't know if you want to respond to that, but go for it.
I mean, just brief, what is missing in the conversation on carbon pricing is the exorbitant profits of the oil and gas industry. And some have been very successful at talking about the cost of the carbon tax. However, we know now from the Bank of Canada that the price on pollution has had a very minimal, if any, effect on inflation. But what's never spoken about is the fact that the oil and gas industry made more profits last year than any year before. In fact, the top 5 alone, I'll cite the statistic, 38 billion from the top 5 oil and gas companies operating in this country alone. And what's not spoken about is the inflationary effects of that gouging of Canadians at the pump, of those profits, and what needs to be done to address those. And so anyone who was serious about addressing inflation would be speaking far more about how we address the excess profits of the oil and gas industry, for example, by bringing about a windfall tax on those profits and reinvesting those in the proven climate solutions that we should have brought in place decades ago.
I just want to add to what Mike has said. The carbon tax is not the only tool in the box, right? There are many other things that need to take place in order for us to decrease our emissions, decrease our carbon footprint at home. And this is something that, it's in many ways it's typical of the liberal approach and to some extent the conservative approach here as well. We've been passing the bill down to the consumers as opposed to taxing the corporations and the big players that are responsible for this state of affairs. These large corporations, whether it's the oil industry or the food industry right now, are using inflation as an excuse to ramp up their profits. And we're seeing that with the large grocery players as well in this country, and that is why they need to be taxed. Now, Poilievre is coming around and saying, look, this inflation is the result of government policy. It is not. This inflation is the result of corporate greed, which Monsieur Poilievre is now trying to defend. The conservatives' objective here, and we need to be very clear, is to make sure that these big corporations, these billionaires, continue to make as much money as they can on the back of average Canadians. He is no defender of average Canadians. He is a defender of large corporations. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Merci.
Can I, either of you, because there's going to be this big debate about grocery stores and prices, what does the Green Party think is a good solution to bring those down?
There is a need for a windfall tax on the profits that have been made. We should have the Competition Bureau, the Bureau de la Compétition, should be looking into the practices of these large players. Once again, it reeks of oligarchy and monopolies in many, many different ways. So we need to use every tool in the box, legally speaking, to make sure that we don't have collusion between these large players to make more money on the back of an unstable international situation and on the back of rising food costs throughout the world. And once again, this is not a purely Canadian phenomena. This is something that is that finds its roots in part in the war in Ukraine and parts in the climate disaster that is affecting food production throughout the world. But there are levers that can be activated by the federal government to ensure that these big corporations do not make money on the back of inflation, and that is what they are doing right now. And that money should be redistributed. We also need to look at food security here at home. This is something that we've been fighting for many, many years in favor of. We need to have more local food production, chains of production, chains of distribution that are closer to home, so that we don't have to rely on food that is produced far away and as a result can provide Canadians with fresh quality products produced here at home. Thank you. Thanks.
As a brief addition, to think that grocery chain CEOs are going to come to Ottawa with the answers when they were already here over 6 months ago at committee, parliamentarians like myself asked them a variety of questions. One of the ones I asked very simply was, well, what do you think about a windfall profit tax? Unsurprisingly, they weren't interested. It's clear we need federal intervention. We ought to have seen that months ago. We need, as Jonathan shared, to see policies introduced. I'm not optimistic that the grocery chain CEOs are going to come in with the answers. As Greens, we want to see affordability measures introduced with urgency, and we're ready to work across party lines to get those done.
Is there no concern that they can just pass the cost on to the consumer if you hit them with more taxes?
That is, the same concern could be shared for the oil and gas industry, as we've seen them continue to increase their profits as well. I think this is where we need to hold them to some accountability. That we're going to hear the same lines from them that it's their supply chain that is to blame. But this is where, as you heard from JP already, we need to see a suite of measures introduced. A windfall profit tax is one of many that would work alongside others to help to address the rising costs.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Merci encore.
Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Recording stopped.